Without an understanding of man's deep-seated urge to self-transcendence, of his very natural reluctance to take the hard, ascending way, and his search for some bogus liberation either below or to one side of his personality, we cannot hope to make sense of our own particular period of history, or indeed of history in general, of life as it was lived in the past and as it is lived today. For this reason, I propose to discuss some of the more common grace substitutes, into which, and by means of which, men and women have tried to escape from the tormenting consciousness of being merely themselves. In France, there is now one retailer of alcohol to every 100 human inhabitants, more or less. In the United States, there are probably at least 1 million desperate alcoholics, besides a much larger number of very heavy drinkers whose disease has not yet become mortal. Regarding the consumption of intoxicants in the past, we have no precise or statistical knowledge. In Western Europe, among the Celts and Teutons, and throughout medieval and early modern times, the individual intake of alcohol was probably even greater than it is today. On the many occasions when we drink tea or coffee or soda pop, our ancestors refreshed themselves with wine, beer, mead, and in later centuries with gin, brandy, and usquebaugh. The regular drinking of water was a penance imposed on wrongdoers, or accepted by the religious, along with the occasional vegetarianism as a very severe mortification. Not to drink an intoxicant was an eccentricity sufficiently remarkable to call for comment and the using of a more or less disparaging nickname. The fact is strangely significant, for it seems to prove that, always and everywhere, human beings have felt the radical inadequacy of their personal existence, the misery of being their insulated selves and not something else, something wider, something in Wordsworthian phrase far more deeply interfused. But in another context, the context of self-dissatisfaction and the urge to self-transcendence, the good is everything in nature by means of which the quality of individual consciousness can be changed. What matters is the awareness, if only for an hour or two, if only for a few minutes, of being someone or, more often, something other than the insulated self. It is not merely that beer does more than Milton can to justify God's ways to man. Beer is the God. Among the Celts, Sabazios was the divine name given to the felt alienation of being dead drunk on ale. Further to the south, Dionysos was, among other things, the supernatural objectification of the paraphysical effects of too much wine. In Vedic mythology, Indra was the god of that now unidentifiable drug called soma. Hero, slayer of dragons, he was the magnified projection upon heaven of the strange and glorious otherness experienced by the intoxicated. Made one with the drug, he becomes a soma Indra, the source of immortality, the mediator between the humans and the divine. In modern times, beer and the other toxic shortcuts to self-transcendence are no longer officially worshipped as gods. Theory has undergone a change, but not practice, for in practice millions upon millions of civilized men and women continue to pay their devotions, not to the liberating and transfiguring spirit, but to alcohol, to hashish, to opium and its derivatives, to the barbiturates, and the other synthetic additions to the age-old catalog of poisons capable of causing self-transcendence. In every case, of course, what seems a god is actually a devil. What seems a liberation is in fact an enslavement. The self-transcendence is invariably downward, into the less than human, the lower than personal. Like intoxication, elementary sexuality, indulged in for its own sake and divorced from love, was once a god, worshipped not only as the principle of fecundity, but as a manifestation of the radical otherness immanent in every human being. In theory, elementary sexuality has long since ceased to be a god, but in practice, it can still boast of countless hosts of sectaries. There is an elementary sexuality which is innocent, and there is an elementary sexuality which is morally and aesthetically squalid. D.H. Lawrence has written very beautifully of the first, Jean Genet with horrifying power and in copious detail of the second. The sexuality of Eden and the sexuality of the sewer, both of them have power to carry the individual beyond the limits of his or her insulated self. In most civilized communities, public opinion condemns debauchery and drug addiction as being ethically wrong, and to moral disapproval is added fiscal discouragement and legal repression. Alcohol is heavily taxed, the sale of narcotics is everywhere prohibited, and certain sexual practices are treated as crimes. But when we pass from drug takers and elementary sexuality to the third main avenue of downward self-transcendence, we find on the part of moralists and legislators a very different and much more indulgent attitude. This seems all the more surprising, since crowd delirium, as we may call it, is more immediately dangerous to social order, more dramatically a menace to that thin crust of decency, reasonableness, and mutual tolerance which constitutes a civilization, than either drink or debauchery. When left to itself, a society generally manages to come to terms with its favorite poison. The drug is a parasite on the body politic, but a parasite which its host, to speak metaphorically, has strength and sense enough to keep under control, and the same applies to sexuality. No society which based its sexual practices upon the theories of the Marquis de Sade could possibly survive, and in fact no society has ever come near to doing such a thing. Even the most easy-going of Polynesian paradises have their rules and regulations, their categorical imperatives and commandments. Against excessive sexuality, as against excessive drug-taking, societies seem to be able to protect themselves with some degree of success. Their defense against crowd delirium and its often disastrous consequences is, in all too many cases, far less adequate. The professional moralists who inveigh against drunkenness are strangely silent about the equally disgusting vice of herd intoxication, of downward self-transcendence into subhumanity by the process of getting together in a mob. Where two or three are gathered together in my name, there am I in the midst of them. In the midst of 200 or 300, the divine presence becomes more problematical. And when the numbers run into the thousands or tens of thousands, the likelihood of God being there, and the consciousness of each individual, declines almost to the vanishing point. For such is the nature of an excited crowd, and every crowd is automatically self-exciting, that, where 2 or 3 thousand are gathered together, there is an absence not merely of deity, but even of common humanity. The fact of being one of a multitude delivers a man from his consciousness of being an insulated self, and carries him down into a less than personal realm, where there are no responsibilities, no right or wrong, no need for thought or judgment or discrimination, only a strong vague sense of togetherness, only a shared excitement, a collective alienation. And the alienation is at once more prolonged and less exhausting than that induced by debauchery, the morning after less depressing than that which follows self-poisoning by alcohol or morphine. Moreover, the crowd delirium can be indulged in, not merely without a bad conscience, but actually, in many cases, with a positive glow of conscious virtue, for so far from condemning the practice of downward self-transcendence through herd intoxication, the leaders of church and state have actively encouraged the practice whenever it could be used for the furtherance of their own ends. Individually, and in the coordinated and purposive groups which constitute a healthy society, men and women display a certain capacity for rational thought and free choice in the light of ethical principles. Herded into mobs, the same men and women behave as though they possessed neither reason nor free will. Crowd intoxication reduces them to a condition of infrapersonal and antisocial irresponsibility. Drugged by the mysterious poison which every excited herd secretes, they fall into a state of heightened suggestibility, resembling that which follows an injection of sodium amytal, or the induction, by whatever means, of a light hypnotic trance. While in this state, They will believe any nonsense that may be bawled at them, will act upon any command or exhortation, however senseless, mad, or criminal. To men and women under the influence of herd poison, whatever I say 3 times is true, and whatever I say 300 times is revelation, is the directly inspired Word of God. That is why men in authority, the priests and the rulers of people, have never unequivocally proclaimed the immorality of this form of downward self-transcendence. True, crowd delirium evoked by members of the opposition and in the name of heretical principles has everywhere been denounced by those in power, but crowd delirium aroused by government agents, crowd delirium in the name of orthodoxy, is an entirely different matter. In all cases where it can be made to serve the interests of the men controlling church and state, downward self-transcendence by means of herd intoxication is treated as something legitimate and even highly desirable. Pilgrimages and political rallies, corybantic revivals and patriotic parades, these things are ethically right so long as they are our pilgrimages, our rallies, our revivals, and our parades. The fact that most of those who take part in these affairs are temporarily dehumanized by herd poison is of no account in comparison with the fact that their dehumanization may be used to consolidate the religious and political powers that be. The ruling minorities make use of their subjects' craving for downward self-transcendence in order, first, to amuse and distract them, and, second, to get them into a subpersonal state of heightened suggestibility. The final symptom of herd intoxication is a maniacal violence. When the revolutionary exploits men's urge to downward self-transcendence, he exploits it to the frantic and demoniac limit. A crowd is the social equivalent of a cancer. The revolutionary encourages his followers to manifest this last and worst symptom of herd intoxication, and then proceeds to direct their frenzy against his enemies, the holders of political, economic, and religious power. In the course of the last 40 years, the techniques for exploiting man's urge towards this most dangerous form of downward self-transcendence have reached a pitch of perfection unmatched in all of history. Meanwhile, new and previously undreamed of devices for exciting mobs have been invented. There is the radio, which has enormously extended the range of the demagogue's raucous yelling. There is the loudspeaker, amplifying and indefinitely reduplicating the heady music of class hatred and militant nationalism. There is the camera, of which it was once naively said that it cannot lie, and its offspring, the movies and television. These three have made the objectification and tendentous fantasy absurdly easy. And finally, there is the greatest of our social inventions, free, compulsory education. Everyone now knows how to read, and everyone consequently is at the mercy of the propagandists, governmental or commercial, who own the pulp factories, the linotype machines, and the rotary presses. Never before have so few been in a position to make fools, maniacs, or criminals of so many. When in revolutionary opposition, they encouraged the mobs under their influence to become destructively violent. Later, when they had come to power, it was only in relation to foreigners and selected scapegoats that they permitted herd intoxication to run its full course. Being in a crowd is the best-known antidote to independent thought. Intimately associated with the ecstasy-producing rite of rhythmic movement is the ecstasy-producing rite of rhythmic sound. Music is as vast as human nature and has something to say to men and women of every level of their being. From the self-regardingly sentimental to the abstractly intellectual, from the merely visceral to the spiritual. In one of its innumerable forms, music is a powerful drug, partly stimulant and partly narcotic, but wholly alternative. No man, however civilized, can listen for very long to African drumming or Indian chanting or Welsh hymn singing and retain intact his critical and self-conscious personality. The constant reiteration of the same word or phrase frequently brings on a state of light or even profound trance. Once induced, this trance can either be enjoyed for its own sake as a delicious sense of infrapersonal otherness, or else deliberately used for the purpose of improving personal conduct by autosuggestion and of preparing the way for the ultimate achievement of upward self-transcendence. Herd intoxication disintegrates the ego more thoroughly than does elementary sexuality. Its frenzies, its follies, its heightened suggestibility can be matched only in the intoxications induced by such drugs as alcohol, hashish, and heroin. But even to the member of an excited mob there may come, at some relatively early stage of his downward self-transcendence, a genuine revelation of the otherness that is above selfhood. This is one of the reasons why some good may sometimes come out of even the most corybantic of revival meetings. Some good, as well as very great evil, may also result from the fact that men and women in a crowd tend to become more than ordinarily suggestible. While in this state they are subjected to exhortations which have the force, when they come once again to their senses, of post-hypnotic commands. Like the demagogue, the revivalist and the ritualist disintegrate the ego of their hearers by herding them together, and dosing them with plenty of vain repetition and rhythmic sound. Then, unlike the demagogue, they give suggestions, some of which may be genuinely Christian. These, if they take, result in a reintegration of broken down personalities on a somewhat higher level. There can also be reintegrations of personality under the influence of the post-hypnotic commands issued by a rabble-rousing politician. But these commands are all incitements to hatred on the one hand, and to blind obedience and compensatory illusion on the other, initiated by a massive dose of herd poison, confirmed and directed by the rhetoric of a maniac who is at the same time a Machiavellian exploiter of other men's weakness. Political conversion results in the creation of a new personality worse than the old and much more dangerous, because wholeheartedly devoted to a party whose first aim is the liquidization of its opponents. I have distinguished between demagogues and religionists, on the ground that the latter may sometimes do some good, whereas the former can scarcely, in the very nature of things, do anything but harm. The demagogues offer such pseudo-positivistic illusions, and the churches do not. As the attractiveness of the churches declines, so also does their influence, so do their wealth, their political power, and, along with these, their capacity for doing evil on a large scale. Deliberately to induce herd intoxication, even if it is done in the name of religion, even if it is all supposedly for the good of the intoxicated, cannot be morally justified. On the subject of horizontal self-transcendence, very little need be said, not because the phenomenon is unimportant, far from it, but because it is too obvious to require analysis and of occurrence too frequent to be readily classifiable. In order to escape from the horrors of insulated selfhood, most men and women choose, most of the time, to go neither up nor down, but sideways. They identify themselves with some cause wider than their own immediate interests, but not degradingly lower, and, if higher, higher only within the range of current social values. This horizontal, or nearly horizontal, self-transcendence may be into something as trivial as a hobby, or as precious as married love. It can be brought about through self-identification with any human activity, from running a business to research in nuclear physics, from composing music to collecting stamps, from campaigning for political office to educating children or studying the mating habits of birds. Horizontal self-transcendence is of the utmost importance. Without it, there would be no art, no science, no law, no philosophy, indeed, no civilization. And there would also be no war, no odium theologicum or ideologicum, no systematic intolerance, no persecution. These great goods and these enormous evils are the fruits of man's capacity for total and continuous self-identification with an idea, a feeling, a cause. How can we have the good without the evil? A high civilization without saturation bombing, or the extermination of religious and political heretics? The answer is that we cannot have it so long as our self-transcendence remains merely horizontal. When we identify ourselves with an idea or a cause, we are in fact worshipping something homemade, something partial and parochial, something that, however noble, is yet all too human. Patriotism, as a great patriot concluded on the eve of her execution by her country's enemies, is not enough. Neither is socialism, nor communism, nor capitalism. Neither is art, nor science, nor public order, nor any given religion or church. All these are indispensable, but none of them is enough. Civilization demands from the individual devoted self-identification with the highest of human causes, but if this self-identification with what is human is not accompanied by a conscious and consistent effort to achieve upward self-transcendence into the universal life of the spirit, the goods achieved will always be mingled with counterbalancing evils. We make, wrote Pascal, an idol of truth itself, for truth without charity is not God, but his image and idol, which we must neither love or worship. And it is not merely wrong to worship an idol, it is also exceedingly inexpedient. The worship of truth apart from charity, self-identification with science unaccompanied by self-identification with the ground of all being, results in the kind of situation which now confronts us. Every idol, however exalted, turns out, in the long run, to be a Moloch, hungry for human sacrifice.